right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Buenos dias. Maria Brengelmeyer, the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist for YouthPower Learning and Evaluation. And since that's such a mouthful, we are calling it YP2LE. I want to mention at the outset that this meeting is being recorded, and we will also, with the recording, provide captioning. If anybody needs that, that will be available then. So for those of you who are new to YouthPower more broadly and YP2LE, I'll just give a quick introduction. So YP2LE is a multi-year USAID-funded project and a continuation of the YouthPower Learning project that some of you may know and probably have participated in. It is focused on a positive youth development approach. So what is PYD? Next slide, please. It's the way we define it is that youth should have assets, for example, skills or financial assets, the ability to leverage those assets through agency, be able to contribute to positive change for themselves, and should be surrounded by an enabling environment that supports them. And our learning network is a reflection of this approach, and we have involved youth throughout the process of redesigning this network. So what does YP2LE comprise? As this slide shows, it aims to achieve systems change via integration of positive youth development principles and frameworks. We will combine global PYD evidence building, stakeholder engagement, knowledge transfer, and application of learning to construct high quality, impactful, and sustainable youth programs, not just ourselves, but also to help other people that are implementing these programs to follow these principles. And our learning network is a key component of knowledge transfer and application of learning. Today's webinar is the first in a series of webinars that we are offering as part of the new learning network. And today's session and two more as part of the systems mapping training are offered by Global Knowledge Initiative, or GKI. And GKI, I think our colleagues will introduce themselves a little bit later. GKI is a subcontractor on the YP2LE project, and they've led the learning network redesign process. So again, some of you may have already met them, and will work with the new community of practice champions over the next year to continue the growth and vibrancy of the communities and other groups under YP2LE. So with that, let me hand it over to my colleagues, and they will provide the introduction and take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So as Maria mentioned, this event is a part of the YouthPower Learning Network activities. So before we jump into the systems mapping webinar, I'm proud to give you a really quick introduction to the Learning Network and also tell you how you can join. The YouthPower Learning Network has been around since 2015 and has over 2,000 members. It's a global community of people of all ages who care immensely about youth and positive youth development. And so in 2020, after 5 years of existence, we wanted to take a pause and reflect to take a pulse of the network. So in March, the YouthPower Learning Network team embarked on an assessment of the first 5 years of the network. And we listened to COP members, champions, USAID, youth lead members, and also network leadership. Our goal was to identify ways in which we could improve the design and function of the network to better meet member needs. And so in September 2020, we launched a refreshed network. And like Maria said, today is the first event under this refreshed network. We're so glad to see you all here, and we really look forward to collaborating with you and working with you in the future. And so with that, as a result of the refreshed network, we will be launching 3 new COPs in the coming month, one which is a brand new topic and two existing topics. And so the first new topic or new COP is the Business, Entrepreneurship and Private Sector Engagement COP, which is focused on building skills in entrepreneurship and on collaboration with the private sector. And the COP will be open to everyone, but initially we'll have an emphasis on the agriculture sector. And then as we get more members and members express interest in other topics, we will also be focusing on those topics such as health, education, and transport. The second COP is youth engagement, which is focused on meaningful youth engagement in all aspects of youth programming. And then the third is gender, which is focused on integrated youth-centered and gender transformative programming through positive youth development. And then, so these are three topics that we've already determined, and there are more about 1 to 2 more COPs forthcoming in the next few months. And those topics will be determined based on what members tell us and what they're interested in. So if any of these COPs sound interesting to you, please join us. We'll be having loads of more interesting conversations such as this one going forward, and the COPs are the home to them. And so you might be wondering how you join a COP if you haven't yet. And so the COP discussion groups are already on youthpower.org. So just head over there and create a profile for yourself if you don't already have one. And also after this presentation, I will send off some detailed instructions for you on how you can join a COP. So members will be able to participate in discussions with fellow members and then also receive updates about upcoming COP events and activities. And we will also be having a formal COP kickoff meeting for each of the COPs throughout November. The first session of the COP kickoff will allow members to jump right in and contribute to developing the COP charter and shaping the COP learning agenda. So members will be able to have meaningful input right from the start. And so with that, we can move on to the topic for today, which is analyzing complex systems and systems mapping. And so this is a first in the series of 3. For those who complete all 3 events, we offer a certificate of completion for your attendance. And so as a reminder, to get the certificate, you will have to join all 3 sessions and then also complete a short quiz after each session that we will email you. And with that, I will hand it over to Morgan to introduce us for today. Or sorry, I think this is Katie. Katie, go ahead. You're muted, Katie.
Thank you. I can't unmute myself for reference later on. Okay. Thank you, Hina and Maria and the YP2LE community. We're really, really excited to be here, and I'm quite surprised and astounded by the number of participants and the great group of people that look like they're on this call. It's really, really quite exciting for us. So thank you for joining. I'll walk us through a quick agenda, and we'll start out with an introduction to the facilitators, how this webinar fits into the series of 3 webinars that we have planned, and then reviewing some learning objectives for today. We'll then move into an introduction to systems sensing and why this is important. From there, we'll start to introduce a type of systems mapping. And at the end of the session, we'll wrap it up with some time practicing and creating loops for a causal loop diagram. So before we dive in, let's meet your co-facilitators. As I said, I'm Katie Safford. I have worked at the Global Knowledge Initiative for the past 3 years, and I really have a passion for working with communities and organizations to harness the power of participatory system sensing activities to create the change that we want to see in this world. I'll hand it over to Morgan, our second co-facilitator, to introduce herself, and then back to Hina to introduce herself as well. Over to you, Morgan.
Good day to everyone. My name is Morgana LaRousse. I'm known as a bit of a technology and data geek, but my real passion is getting people talking and playing. And for me, data and technology is one of the tools that I use to get people engaged. And that's the lens that I approach systems thinking in, and have a particular interest in using visuals to map systems. And pass it on to my colleague, Hina.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Hina Acharya, and I'm a communities manager for the YouthPower Learning Network. And so for the past year, I've worked really closely with the YouthPower Learning YP2LE team to facilitate the co-creation of the YouthPower Learning Network refresh. And so as a communities manager, my job is to make sure that all of you, all of the members, feel like you're included, that the work that you're doing is productive, and that you're being engaged. And so I'm really excited to see everyone here and get to know you more as a communities manager for this network. Katie, back to you.
Thank you. So as we said, this is the first session of a three-part series. In today's session, we'll introduce system sensing and the importance of system sensing. We understand that many of you might be already familiar with system sensing and systems tools, but we want to use this session to set our levels and get everyone speaking the same language about systems. The second session, which will take place on November 4th, we'll be working from a case study to map a specific system. This session will give you all the chance to work in small groups to create a map together. In the third session, which will take place on November 17th, we will use the map that we created in the prior session to figure out what do we do next. We have this great map, but how do we use this to make decisions around? And so for today's learning objectives, we want you all to understand the value of system sensing. We want you all to experience how to practically apply system sensing with a few examples of creating loops. And we want to give you all access to resources so that you can continue your system sensing journey. And hopefully you'll join us for the next 2 webinars to also continue that journey. So before I hand it over to Morgan to give us an introduction to system sensing, I want to mention a few rules of engagement for today. This is quite a large webinar, and so we're going to ask that everyone please mute themselves. And we're going to ask for you all to ask questions in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout this webinar, and we'll try to get to answering as many questions as possible. If we don't answer your question today, we'll try to answer them in subsequent questions, or perhaps send out answers to questions in email. And then lastly, Hina is our tech guru for the call, so please ping her with any questions. If you're having connection issues, etc., she'll be your go-to person. So now I'll hand it over to Morgan to talk us through and introduce us to system sensing.
If we could go straight to the next slide, please. I'll take us in. So what is system sensing? Let's start by unpacking what a system is and how that fits. You yourself are a complex system within infinite systems. So let's just think about all the elements that go into the smallest act, like picking out what color socks you'll wear today or what you'll have for breakfast. Now, zoom out to level with me. What you have for breakfast is impacted and influenced by decisions that might feel a world away from your morning routine. It's influenced by systems of agricultural and trade policies that affect the ingredients that farmers are growing for you to find at your local grocery store, by cultural norms, by the weather systems affecting global food supply and national level systems and governments, or just by your mood that day. And zooming out a few more levels, we find the system at play in global warming, the planetary system that determines our relationship with the sun, time, and the expansion of the universe. So it gets pretty big out there. That realization that everything is interconnected can feel really overwhelming, but we mustn't let it paralyze us. We've all been through this before. Some studies suggest that as a baby, you actually had a truer perception of the whole system and how interconnected everything is around us than you do now as an adult. Part of the process of growing up and being able to engage with the world around us is, as humans, is the development of filters through which you see filters that allow us to see the system that we're a part of. Little by little, with the help of those who brought us up, we learned which connections to pay attention to and which ones to ignore. But in some ways, we have the tendency to overfilter. We look for patterns everywhere and we stick to them. Recognizing patterns makes us feel safe. They help us compartmentalize and make sense of things. And they make us feel like we know what to do next. Unfortunately, some of these patterns feed into assumptions about the world around us that don't quite match up to the truth. But when we're able to put aside our assumptions and understand how things are truly connected, we tend to work better together and make better decisions. Within almost every faith on the planet, people commit entire lifetimes to appreciating the beauty of the world's interconnected systems. For today, though, we're going to adjust our lens. We don't have that much time. We only have an hour and a half. So let's zoom out from the madness or sanity of your own heads and zoom in from interplanetary exploration. And let's get together to learn practical ways to get to know the systems that we've chosen to dedicate our working lives to unpacking. Next slide, please, Hina. So how can we apply a systems perspective? You might be asking yourself, and that might be why you're here today. And my answer is that you're already doing it. Although we have a tendency to plan in a linear way, we think problem plus solution equals success, happiness, happy people. Once we get into the work itself, we often run into barriers and we find ourselves having to adapt. I'm very confident that everyone in this room, in this Zoom, does this, and you've all had moments where you've had to pivot. You've realized that something wasn't working, you've taken into account a new perspective, and you've adjusted your product, your output, or the course of your programming. What we're advocating for today is embedding this systems perspective, this approach that you already do in times of stress, not just once you're in action and when the problems have begun, but into your planning phase and throughout your work in an intentional way. That means using diverse perspectives from the start to create a more complete view of the system you're operating in and how you can best play your part within it. Accepting that we're all human and that we're emotional and at times irrational, and being open to the fact that our motivations are not always logical. Recognizing and working with both informal and formal structures, we mustn't ignore the power of individuals who are part of the system without an official title or an official role, not your usual stakeholders. And designing feedback loops and opportunities to pause and reflect to create an iterative working style that can adapt to an evolving system. So the adaptation is designed in, built in, not just in response to crises. Next slide, please. So why is it so important to be intentional about this from the start? Here's Hina with some examples of failures that could have been avoided or mitigated by employing systems perspectives in the early days.
Thank you, Morgan. So a great demonstration of why system sensing is important comes from a series of investigative articles published on DevX on failed aid. This journalism project is one of my favorite reads because it stresses on focusing and being honest about our failures to do better moving forward. And so the What Went Wrong project is an impact evaluation led by recipients of the aid project that failed them. And one of the examples in this, which is one of my favorite examples, comes from a town in Kenya where the government was trying to combat open defecation and pollution. The project team built community toilets, one of the largest and most ambitious projects in government projects in Kenya. The government then handed the toilets over to a youth group to run it as a business. For a few weeks, everything was fine, everything was normal, it was going great. However, problems started cropping up. First, there was a water shortage. However, they'd failed to build water tanks to prepare for the scenario. Next, bigger problems arose, faulty sewage lines, which the youth who ran the toilets could not afford to fix. And so the toilets were not used for their intended purposes of combating open defecation a few weeks after they had opened. Another example is of a community which opened up a gender violence hotline to help with investigations of gender-based violence. The idea, which was a great one, was to centralize reporting so that each case could be quickly communicated to relevant departments, such as healthcare, forensics, and police. However, the team faced many problems. One was an unreliable phone network. Two was cultural norms, where in some communities, the community elders solved disputes, so people did not call the hotline. And even further, something as simple as the phone number, which was really long and difficult to remember, ensured that people were not using this hotline. So while these projects failed for many reasons, one thread that's common between all of them was a failure to communicate between the multiple stakeholders, the project team, the aid recipients, and also other community members, to think through issues that might arise and then plan for those. And so with that, I will pass it on to Morgan to explain why this is related to system sensing.
So as we all know, these are just two of infinitesimal examples of solutions designed miles away from the problem, not engaging the actors themselves, and not realizing it's a case of unintended consequences from a lack of understanding of how the system is all connected. So what we want to do is to give you the tools through systems mapping and systems thinking approaches to make sure that you can find out who the right people are and bring the right people together, help them understand their own systems and their own roles within it, so that you can design together sustainable responses that can adapt to real situations that evolve and affect real humans with all of their beautiful flaws. And that real humans piece is a piece that I keep coming back to in this. Next slide. Systems thinking is now unavoidable. So welcome aboard, everyone. This is the slide that proves that we're not alone in this pursuit. There are many frameworks, including USAID's 5 R's framework you might be familiar with, and FSG's 6 conditions of systems change, which both emphasize approaches promoting the importance of roles and relationships for making systems level change. There's also very famous systems iceberg model. And this, emphasizes very visually, there's what we can see, which is above, but there's just so much going on underneath. And so if you're not having conversations and not bringing people together who know the true shape of the iceberg, then you're not really getting to the root of the problem. Next slide. So how can we apply system sensing? We can apply this at we're looking to apply this at every stage of programming, of every stage of an intervention, a solution. If you're an entrepreneur, it's about not just looking at the final solution, but looking at how it fits in across the board. So we would start with gathering experiences from your community, gain a holistic understanding of the needs of the people you're working with. Then co-designing a strategy with the community to create trust and find mutually beneficial solutions. Facilitating collaboration, new partnerships, and ways of working towards a goal, and monitoring the approach through community feedback and adapting as you gain a better understanding of community needs. So this is drawn as a cycle, but you should maybe think of it as more of a very tightly wound spring, because as you continue to monitor throughout every stage, your approach is going to change. You're going to advance little by little. Those of you familiar with USAID's systems practice framework might recognize that our systems sensing cycle aligns very closely with the guiding principles of listening to the system to appreciate how it currently operates, engaging the system to prompt change, discovering the actual effects of those interventions on the system, and finally adapting interventions in response to discoveries. Next slide. Throughout all of this, keep in mind that system sensing is not a silver bullet. It's one of many processes that can help your work act stronger. It's an approach that's used continuously during a project process and not at discrete times. As I mentioned, the monitoring and adapting is just a thought. It's a muscle. It's a way of working that if you keep doing will get stronger and you can apply throughout your work. And finally, it requires the voices of many to create a holistic understanding. It's about meaningful connections. Next slide. The system sensing is a way for people to come together and understand each other's voices. In other words, it's a process to build connections and trust within a community and help people move forward to address complex challenges. And always remember, next slide, when you gather stakeholders to develop a picture of a system, you must have a deep respect for the fact that the system and the learnings from that picture belong to the people in the room. If you have an opportunity when you're doing systems mapping or when you're bringing in these stakeholders to give them the skills to be doing exactly the kind of exploration you're doing so that they can run it themselves, that's far more useful to give them the skills to continue creating their own solutions. Next slide. So I'd love for you to leave with this idea that everything is interconnected, but I don't want you to feel overwhelmed, and we want to avoid paralysis. So what now? This is where I hand it over to Katie, who will help us understand the system that we're all and you are all trying to make decisions in. Thank you, Katie.
Are you having a hard time
Yes.
unmuting, Katie? Okay.
I can't unmute myself because I'm not a co-host. Sorry, that's an oversight by us. Thank you. So now that Morgan has talked us through the benefits of system sensing and its value, we understand that there are many frameworks and methods out there to apply systems sensing. One of the most common ways to do this is through systems mapping. Like we said, over the next 3 webinars, we'll be using one specific type of systems mapping called causal loop diagram. The methods we'll be sharing with you over the next 3 webinars are based off of our experience working with communities and organizations to apply systems sensing. I would like to mention that a causal loop diagram may not be the best method for your particular system. We want to use this series of webinars to explain the benefits and primary uses of causal loop diagram so that you all are able to make the decision on if causal loop diagram is the best solution for you. Next slide, Hina. Many of you have probably heard of causal loop diagram. It's one of the most popular types of systems mapping because it shows how human behavior perpetuates norms. As you probably know from your work, human behavior is one of the hardest things to analyze, let alone to actually change. We oftentimes use causal loop diagram as a way to visualize individual cause and effect chains that represent the pieces of the system. And then we visualize how those chains relate to one another by connecting the individual loops in a larger diagram. You can see that on this slide, there's an example of a causal loop diagram. Right now, we understand that this might look very confusing and overwhelming, and you can't even read it. But our hope is by the end of this series, you will be able to understand what this causal loop diagram might be telling us. So let's break down the elements of a causal loop diagram. A causal loop diagram consists of nodes, or the item, activity, or behavior that is changing, and linkages. The nodes are represented by the circles, and the linkages are represented by the arrows. On the linkage, you will see there's directionality shown by which way the arrow is pointing. There's also polarity, which is shown by the positive and negative signs on each arrow. Polarity shows us how one node influences the next node. For example, on this diagram, you can see that a decrease in node 1 leads to an increase in node 2. This increase in node 2 then leads to a decrease in node 3, sorry. So let's take this to a real life example so it makes a little more sense. So if my energy is low, denoted by this negative sign on the first arrow, this increases my likelihood to drink a lot of caffeine. I personally reach for a lot of coffee. This increase of drinking coffee is denoted by the positive sign. The more coffee I drink, which is denoted by the positive sign on the second arrow, the harder it is for me to sleep at night, denoted by a negative sign on the second arrow. So let's try to translate this into an entire loop on the next slide. hopefully you're beginning to understand the individual components, but creating the loop is a harder part of creating a causal loop diagram. Our brains tend to think in linear chains and not in loops. So when we're trying to close the loop, we need to ask ourselves, what does this node lead to next? So if we're referring back to this coffee loop we started on the last slide, we know that personally, when my energy level is low, I reach for a large cup of coffee. However, for me, this really hinders my ability to sleep. When my ability to sleep decreases, that then decreases my ability to wake up in the morning. That causes me to wake up with low energy, thus reinforcing my need to drink more coffee. You can see there's also this mini loop inside of the larger outside loop. This mini loop represents that when I increase my likelihood to drink caffeine, my dependence on that caffeine also goes up. The more dependent I am on this caffeine, the more that hinders my ability to sleep at night as well. So although many people can probably relate to this story, some might not rely on coffee quite like I do. This loop represents my experience of drinking coffee and perhaps my addiction to coffee as well. Others might have a different experience. This shows us that the importance of having diverse perspectives in the room when you're creating a causal loop diagram is extremely important. The way that I experience the system might be different than the way my colleague Morgan or Hina or you experience the system. For instance, you might go to tea, or you might not be addicted to any sort of caffeine, which is impressive, and I wish I was more like you. So now we're going to talk about the steps you need to take in order to create a causal loop diagram. Next slide, Hina. So now that you understand what a loop is, let's talk about how you create the entire diagram. It's not just about the individual loops. It's about utilizing a process to bring many voices together and to learn how everyone's experiences the system differently from yourself. When you see how others experience the system, you're able to better understand your bias and see where there might be gaps or misaligned incentives. As Morgan spoke to earlier, we learned that as babies, we tend to not have this bias. But as we grow up, we begin to have these mental models that shape the way that we engage. Sorry, my cat is in my lap, guys, and hopefully you all can relate to the struggle. So for the first step, I'll just mention this is a very high level list of steps. It's quite a nuanced process, and we'll walk you through the process, but this is to give you an idea of what's coming up for all of us. So the first step to creating a causal loop diagram is gaining a preliminary insight through research or the use of a framework that Morgan mentioned, such as the 5 R's or the iceberg model. You can also conduct interviews to gain this research and insight into the system. The second step is determining 6 to 8 priority forces. These forces are key ideas that shape the way the system behaves. Generally, we create time for ideating and then narrow it down to our key forces by voting. Step 3 is where we will focus most of our time today. And this step, you identify nodes and linkages to create loops for each of the forces that we identified in step 2. Step 4 is creating a narrative for each loop. Writing a narrative really helps to improve comprehension and also serves as a way to test the loop's logic. As you are writing the narrative, if you see that the narrative is filling in lots of gaps, then you perhaps need to expand your loop and add to it. Step 5 is linking the loops together to see how the different forces in the system are interrelated. This is generally one of the hardest steps to do. And lastly, step 6, the causal loop does not tell you anything unless you create a space for conversation. You'll notice that we're going to drive this point home many, many times, because a lot of times we have a tendency to create a map and hand it over and expect people to understand how to use it. But the beauty of a causal loop diagram is that it allows people to visualize the system in a new way and also see how others might view the system differently. You can utilize tools like leverage point analysis or stakeholder analysis to determine where the system might be ripe for change and who should be involved in creating that change. So we won't have time to walk through all of these steps today, but we will work primarily on step 3. I'm noticing there are some comments on reviewing the plus and minus signs in the loop. So perhaps we go back to that slide and I'll walk through it one more time and hopefully everyone can understand. We're also going to practice creating loops later on. And so hopefully you'll be able to get a hang of it then. So Hina, perhaps when I talk through it, you can point, yeah, perfect. So we're gonna start with the energy level node that Hina's highlighting. So as I said, when I wake up, my energy level might be really low. And so when my energy level is low, that increases the likelihood for me to drink caffeine. With that increase in drinking caffeine, that then will hinder my ability or decrease my ability to sleep at night. When I'm not able to sleep at night, and that's negatively impacting my sleep, I'm then also not able to wake up in the morning. When I'm not able to easily wake up in the morning, that also leads me to continue to have low energy. I hope the following along the loop makes a little more sense in the plus and minus signs and how those tell you if a node increases or decreases. There are many ways to represent positive and negative signs on a loop. This is just my preferred method, and so we can talk about this later on. Okay, I think I'm seeing that that makes sense, so I'm hoping that helped. Thanks, Hina.
Yep.
So now we're going to give you all a chance to practice. And I realized at the beginning, we forgot to mention to grab a piece of paper and a pen. So I'm hoping that, or pencil might be preferred, but I'm hoping that most of you all can easily grab a piece of paper near you. And we're going to give you all a chance to actually practice creating loops on your own and then reflect on that process of creating loops. So we're going to start taking baby steps. We're going to start with providing you with these 5 nodes and asking you all to take 5 minutes to try to turn these 5 nodes into a loop. They are not written in the correct order, so please create the order that you think will create a loop, and take 5 minutes to do this. So I'm going to ask that you all, we're going to be quiet, take some time to do this, and then we can share our nodes later. And if you're having trouble talking yourself through the creation of a loop, I'm happy to help by giving hints. So please try and then flag in the chat if you're having trouble doing this. And we can perhaps give you some hints. So I'm seeing that hints might perhaps be helpful. So I'll begin to walk you through what our loop looks like. Don't go to the next slide, Hina. But the first node is actually the global spread of COVID-19. And so then if you write that on your piece of paper, you would then ask yourself, what did the global spread of COVID-19 lead to? And how did the next node, how did that node influence the next node that you might think it led to? So for us, the global spread of COVID-19, or for you, it might have led to many different things. But there's one node on here that will hopefully be obvious in the immediate thing that it led to. So I'm seeing people say lockdown in the chat and hospitalizations and death increase. Yes, so I would say that the initial was hospitalizations. And then after that, because of the hospitalizations, we then instilled lockdown measures by the government. They were established. So the immediate would be hospitalizations, which would be your next node. And I'll ask you to draw the polarity and how the global spread of COVID-19 then affected the hospitalizations. And then after we saw an increase in hospitalizations, what did we then see next? Yep, so I'm seeing a lot of answers of health systems overwhelmed, which is correct. And so I'll ask you to add polarity to that one as well. And then I'll give you like 1 more minute to hopefully finish the loop out, and then we'll present our example loop on the next slide. And I'm also seeing a lot of comments about economic crisis and how it affected the economy. That is also a loop that you could create because it did lead to a lot of economic challenges. But this one is mostly based around the hospitals and how it affected hospitals in lockdown. Okay, so I think we'll go to and we'll share our loop. Your loop might look a little different from ours, but we'll give you an idea. Hopefully this will reinforce the positive and negatives. So if we start with global spread of COVID-19, the increase of the global spread led to an increase of hospitalizations and deaths as a result of COVID-19. This increase in hospitalizations led to an increase of the health system being overwhelmed. This increase of the health system being overwhelmed led governments to establish lockdown measures. This increase in lockdown measures led to an increase of schools, offices, and public spaces being shut down. And as we saw the schools, offices, and public spaces being shut down, we did see a decrease in the spread of COVID-19. However, now that we are a little farther in and the lockdown measures started opening up, this loop might look a little different because we initially saw a decrease, but now as we've opened things back up, we're seeing an increase again. And so that shows how this loop will just go around in a continuous circle until we have something such as a vaccine that would disrupt this reinforcing loop. And so I'm sure with this example, you're thinking of a lot of different ways that COVID has also affected our day-to-day lives. And so that takes us to our next activity. We're going to look at other parts of the system. And for this part, we're going to focus on how social distancing has affected your work. And so I'm going to ask that everyone share in the chat 3 negative and 3 positive impacts of social distancing. And if you can denote a negative sign or a positive sign before your answer so that we're clear on how you're viewing this. We're going to take 5 minutes, maybe less if that's not quite needed, to share 3 positives and 3 negatives. If you can't come up with 3, that's fine, but I ask that you try to think of at least 1 positive and 1 negative. So I'm seeing more time with immediate family as a great positive. I've definitely experienced that as well. More flexible working hours as a positive. Someone's been having a challenge reaching partners in remote areas with poor connectivity. I think that's something that I've experienced as well. Having, even at my house, I've had trouble with my internet not being good enough. We had that challenge this morning, and I was worried I wasn't even going to be on this webinar. So someone has also highlighted the loss of face-to-face contact and social support. That's definitely, and the feeling of isolation. Someone on the ladder said that they have felt more connected to their team because they were already remote, so it doesn't feel that different to them. Someone also mentioned more outdoor activities with friends, which is definitely true. Healthier lifestyle. No commute as a positive. I can definitely relate to all of those. As a negative, more dependency on technology and internet. That's definitely been a challenge for many. Someone has also felt it's negatively affected their performance due to connectivity problems. And so this leads us to our next slide, where we're going to try to practice creating a loop, specifically around the use of new virtual technologies. I think a lot of us have experienced at the beginning of COVID, specifically back in maybe April, everyone was trying new technologies and you're trying to get used to different technologies. And now maybe perhaps you've picked your favorite technologies, but we want to give you all the opportunity to create your own loop based on your experience and how the use of new virtual technologies has affected your work. And so I'm going to ask for everyone to go back to their piece of paper and create a loop around virtual technologies. So we're going to take 5 or so minutes to do that as well. I'm seeing lots of great answers continue to come in on the chat about how social distancing has affected our lives as well. So it's looking from the people that are on video that perhaps some of you are done creating your loops. I would like to invite people, if you're comfortable, to come off of mute, mention in the chat box that you want to share so that we can unmute you. And I would like to invite anyone who's interested in sharing their loop. If you could try to hold up your piece of paper and show us what your loop might look like, we can begin to understand how use of technology has affected people differently. I've seen some people in the chat have sort of shared a loop that they've created. So if you're interested in sharing, please type in the chat, I'd like to share, and we'll ask you all to come, we'll unmute you so that you can share. Is anyone interested? So it looks like Yasir, you are interested in sharing. I'll invite, or I'll ask Morgan or Hina to, oh, I think I can unmute you. I will try to find you.
Katie, if you select people, I'm ready to unmute.
Okay, I'll ask Yasir Mohammed Sani to share first.
Hello.
Hello.
Yasir, if you could introduce yourself before we start.
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Sani Asur Muhammad from Nigeria. Are you with me?
We're with you.
Yes.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you all for this wonderful information. So the use of new virtual technologies, when it is positive, the distance learning too will be positive. And also at the edge of the distance learning, when it is positive too, then it will increase innovation. And at the edge of innovation, if it is positive, again, this global community too will be positive. And that is how the loop will be looping through positively. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's definitely an interesting take on the increase in innovation. I love that.
Thank you.
So next I'll invite Miriam Swift. You mentioned that you would like to share your loop. So we will unmute you and invite you to introduce yourself and present your loop.
Hi, I'm Mariam. I'm an Education Development Officer in Asia TS. And I found that the loop was quite simple in this case with, let me just, with more use of new virtual technologies. So there will be a plus. The B will be reach of more stakeholders and partners. And with that being positive, the next one will also be positive. We will have more engagement of partners and stakeholders, which will then be creating more comfort using new technologies to keep communicating. And after that, we reach the initial loop, which is the node, which is increased use of new virtual technologies. So that would be a very positive loop. We could also reverse it and make it very negative by saying we lose contact with the stakeholders because people don't like to engage, and so on and so forth. So whichever way we want to work it out, it's going to be a very simple loop in my view. That's over. Thank you.
Thank you. That aligns very closely to the example loop that GKI, our company, came up with. So we've experienced it both ways, where sometimes using new technologies has brought people together, and then other times, because of extenuating circumstances like bandwidth, it's been very difficult and they've been very turned off by using technologies. So I think that that's great that you came up with basically two loops. So I'll next invite Marjorie to share her loop and present and tell us where you're from, where you are, and who you work with. Marjorie Masseri, I'm not going to pronounce your name correct, so we'll not try.
Okay, I'm Marjorie Massiera, and I'm in Arlington, Virginia. And I did a loop related to the work I do as a trainer. After COVID hit, we had to switch live trainings to online. And so I don't know if you can see my little loop. It might be a little hard to see, but sorry, my handwriting's not best either. But I put that, I actually learned a new skill using Adobe Connect for training, which led to more effective training management over some other systems that we had been trying with before, which did lead to more opportunities for new kinds of training in other contexts, which then led to use of even more virtual technology. I also found a small loop in the sense that some of the trainings people were not happy with because of bandwidth issues or just how we adjusted some of the content. And so that led to exploration of more effective management. But I was seeing if in general things had not turned out well, I didn't know, that was my question, that maybe it doesn't feed back to use of new virtual technologies, that maybe people would just pull back from that. And then I didn't know if all loops need to kind of be, you know, coming back to where you started, or if you end up somewhere else, you know, how is that referred to? I don't know if you could talk about that at some point.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks for asking and sharing your loop. You're right. Not all things in this world are actually loops. We use causal loop diagram because it's a different way of thinking. We tend to think very linearly. And so this sort of forces you to ask the question, is this a loop? But it doesn't have to be a loop. And in the future webinars, we'll show you more of a larger picture of an actual causal loop diagram. And you'll see there are also there are specific loops, but then there will also be connecting pieces and thoughts which connect all of those loops together. And perhaps that would be a chain and not necessarily a loop. And so you can incorporate that into the causal loop diagram because it is an important aspect to the story. But not necessarily a specific loop. So that's a great question. Okay, so I'm seeing there are lots of people that are still interested in sharing. So we might not get through everyone that's interested in sharing, but I will invite Amy Chang next to share.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Amy Ochiel, and from Kenya. So my loop looks in this manner, in that the use of virtual technology has had negative impact, especially for us who are involved in implementing activities in the field. So it has led to reduced field work. And because now we have reduced fieldwork, then that also negatively impacts the targets that we had as an organization. So delays in the attainment of the project targets. And if we delay in the project targets, then again, another negative impact is that there will be poor performance of the project, and in which that leads to also a delay in improving the livelihoods of people within the community. So that is my loop. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. That's a really different perspective from what most of us have had. So that's very, very helpful to hear. So next I'll ask Sam Shekamoy to introduce himself and present his loop.
They are the loop, they are the technology. It's we talk about virtual learning or knowledge, because technology has increased in the knowledge of people. Like for us who have started organization, we have been using the technology to do a research, how we can get more knowledge and connect with other people. Then technology has increased job creation. It has increased job creation and networking, connectivity, because like what we are doing here, I'm here in Sierra Leone, we have connected globally, we are learning together, we are experiencing difficult things together during COVID-19. I think it is good because of technology, and then the technology has increased in awareness raising campaign, because without technology, young people will have not stand up for voice out their voices on negative impact in society. Because when we talk about the awareness raising campaign, we have used it to raise awareness, hold governments accountable, and so that they can empower women and young people so that they can be accountable. Because we have seen rally online being used by young people globally. And then also we have to look at the laziness also, because we have used now like to sit down and listen. Like someone mentioned about we have been involved in meeting the grassroots, engaging them, talking to them, but now that have not been done. So these are some of the challenges. So technology has made us to be lazy also at this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's great that you highlighted both challenges as well as what's worked great for you. It's wonderful to hear that you've had positive experiences, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out how to get past the challenges. So I know others are interested in sharing, but for time's sake, we're going to move on, unfortunately. But we'll have plenty of time to I'm seeing that there's another question on loops. Sorry. We'll have plenty of time to practice in the future 2 sessions. So I'll just ask that you join us if you want to continue looping and having fun doing this. So I'm seeing that Laura asked a question that not all loops are neat circles, but that they do need to get back to the original node, or they're not loops at all, just a list of bulleted lists of consequences. And so, yeah, I want to highlight that because I think it's a great point. And I think that, like I was saying before, the whole idea of causal loop diagram is that it sort of forces you to think differently, where we tend to not think in loops and how one thing affects the next thing. And so taking the time to try to close that loop is really, really important and is the hardest step in this process. And so this is, as Morgan said earlier, this is a muscle. You really learn and you get better at doing it the more you do it. In the beginning, closing the loop is often the hardest thing to do. And so I'll highlight that, yes, Laura, you're correct. Loops are key to causal loop diagram. However, I'll still say not all loops are loops. Not all thoughts or series can be created into loops. So sort of if but. And Morgan, I'll ask if you have anything to add to this as well.
Yes, you can say I'm bursting here to add that, as I mentioned in the chat, Laura, yes, loops can be loops because they could be neat circles, they can be figure of 8s, they can be all sorts of shapes and sizes. And we do aim for all loops to be closed. But ultimately, we need to think about what's the purpose of this process. And the real magic is we're getting people in one room to talk about the issues that they're facing and their particular perspective on the system. And so sometimes if I'm facilitating a session and there's a particular piece of the narrative that doesn't close off quite so well, but feels really important to the members of that room, I might break the rules so that the map can tell the story that belongs to the people that are building the map. So I think the key is we have our fundamentals of how to do systems mapping, but ultimately we have to come back to what's the purpose here and what's going to get people talking and how are they relating to their story.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Morgan. So I think we'll move on we'll share our example loop, which I think is very similar to what many of you all have shared. So this is actually a more negative one than what many have said. But the use of new virtual technologies has led to an increased need of technology infrastructure, which has led to an increased need in the improvement of tech infrastructure, which has led to many people creating new options. We've discovered a lot of new sort of startups beginning to create new ideas and new tech resources, and a lot of companies have been sharing the way that they use tech and to create great webinars and great experiences. And so that increase in tech resources has also led to a resistance to using new technologies, because we begin to feel overwhelmed. We might have a bad experience using it, whatever it may be. We have experienced some resistance, which then leads that decrease in resistance then leads to I'm seeing that the plus and minus signs are wrong here, so sorry. That decrease in resistance then leads to more and more virtual technologies being used, because we are still searching for the next best technology. And so it just is a loop that shows the continuous hunt for the next best thing and the best technology. I think this was the experience that I had in the very beginning of social distancing and working from home, but it might have changed by now. Now I feel like I have my top 3 technologies. I stick to those and I try not to change because that's what I'm comfortable with. And so maybe I am an example of that resistance, because I got tired of trying new things, learning new things. Just like, I want to stick with what I know. So this is our example. And so then I think we'll move to the next slide, Hina. We want to give you all time to reflect. What did you learn from this? What felt good? What felt difficult? And then if you all have any final questions, I'll ask that you write them in the chat, and perhaps we invite people to come off mute if they want to speak. Please raise your hand if you'd like to come off mute and ask a question that might be too long to type in the chat. So Jill, I would actually love to hear from your learnings. Why do you think this doesn't address inequality? And how might we perhaps change this process to address that? Would you be interested in speaking to the group on this topic?
Okay, I couldn't unmute before, so that took a moment. I'm sorry. So I've had a private conversation with Morgan, and I hope it's not illegal for me to sort of talk about that. Morgan?
No, divulge away.
Okay, cool. So if you look at where funding from USAID goes, it rarely goes to the community groups that you're asking us to involve. I mean, I can speak more knowledgeably about groups of women living with HIV. There's very little that goes to the grassroots groups. It's funneled through USAID IP. So that's unequal at the very start. In terms of, and I'm sorry I had to jump off for another call, so forgive me if I've missed something, but in terms of the virtual technology, we know that women have less access, particularly women in countries, the poorest countries, and the poorest within the poor countries have the least access to virtual technology. Just had a huge impact on learning, which there's a report by Save the Children UK, not the one in the US, that's excellent about the learning gaps because of this. So those are sort of a few things that come to mind where I see a real weakness in this approach. It's not that it's not useful. I've learned something, but I think it's got some real deficits that I'd love to know how you plan to address. Over and out.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I think that's very helpful to think about, and from a USAID perspective as well to think about. But I would say that specifically from what I know about the YouthPower Network is we have a lot of people that are working on the ground in these individual communities. And so I actually think that this network is probably a key way to have people working on the ground. We understand that during COVID, technology is a challenge. And if we're not able to meet in person, that does make things more difficult. And I think that brings up a really good point that although right now we're doing this mapping virtually, most of the time I've actually done mapping in person. So gone to communities or to an organization and worked in person with sticky notes and flip charts to actually create the loops while we're all in the room. And I think it's a very good point to know that you have to have the right people in the room or on the webinar when you're doing this. And that's definitely, the map is as good as the diversity in the room. And so I think that's a really lovely point. So I'm seeing a lot of thoughts around how this is helping us think a little differently and not look at things so linearly, which is great to hear. So I see that, Matt, you asked if there is a way to account for different actors or perspectives in this model, in a causal loop diagram. And I think that's a really, really good question. So it's generally, at least in my experience, when we've created loops, we've tried to specify in each node whose perspective this is so that it's clear. So if we're working with a group of farmers or a group of beekeepers or whatever, we say farmer thinks this so that it's very clear whose perspective the loop is representing. Also, when we create a loop in a causal loop diagram in Kumu, which is a platform that we use a lot to create these causal loop diagrams, you can label each loop and give it a title. And so a lot of times we'll use the title to sort of show which loop, whose perspective that is representing. But I think that's a very important note, because if you don't do that, it's very difficult to understand. And I'll also add that the narrative helps with this as well, because we always suggest creating a narrative for each loop so that someone who wasn't in the room creating the map can still understand what each loop is saying. Morgan, I'll ask if you see any questions or thoughts that you'd like to highlight in the chat.
Yes, Sumali, I think the systems mapping is a useful tool, but like anything, it will need to be adapted to specific situations and groups. I was about to type this out, but I might as well say it out loud, that I think you're spot on. This is all about getting people talking. In the first half, we were bringing you in on systems approaches and systems perspectives, and those can be applied in many different ways and can just be a way of thinking that you start to bring into problem solving. And the looping process is just one way. It's just one of the tools in your arsenal for approaching this in a multi-stakeholder situation. But we have a plethora of different ways of doing it, and this is just one of the ones that we thought would be most interesting to train you on today.
Thanks, Morgan. So with that, continue to post your thoughts and reflections and questions. We'll try to address more of them in the next two webinars, but I will hand it over to Hina to talk about next steps and what the next session will look like.
Thanks, Katie. So today was all about the basics, and now that we have the basics down, our process will be much more interactive. These loops, as many of you pointed out, are very simple, and so one causal loop diagram can have, up to 30, 40, infinite number of loops. So we'll be getting more into the complexity next time. What we'll be doing is separating into breakout rooms and working collaboratively to build a causal loop diagram from a case study that we put together. So we do need everyone to come prepared for the next session. Please read the case study that we'll share with you over email, and this will be sent to you tomorrow at the latest. And then, as I mentioned, in order to get the certification, you'll need to attend all 3 sessions and then take a quiz post each of the sessions. So we'll also be sending you that quiz before the next session. And we're really excited to see you next time, and looking forward to answering all the amazing questions that you've asked and all the nuance that comes with causal loop diagramming. In addition, we have some resources that you can look up in case you want to learn more about systems change and systems practice and the different ways that others are using this practice. Katie, do you want to talk a little bit more about these additional resources?
Sure. I would just say that they're great resources. But before we dive into these resources, I'd like to also say I'm seeing there's a little bit of sort of confusion on the process of creating a causal loop diagram, and I want to hit that point before we get off of the webinar today. I think today our goal was to just get you all comfortable with what a loop is and how to create a loop. And then in the next 2 webinars, we'll actually go through the entire process of sourcing ideas, coming up with forces in the system that are at play, and then narrowing those forces down and creating loops from those forces. And so we'll start from the very beginning, whereas today, if you remember back to the list of steps, we started at step 3, which I know might be a little confusing, but we wanted to make sure you all understood what a loop was before we went through the entire process. And so in the next 2 webinars, we'll go through the whole process so you're understanding how this might work in a workshop, or if you were to take this activity and conduct it in the field or with your organization or with your friends or colleagues, the entire process from start to finish. So I'll just say that you need to come to the next 2 webinars so that you can understand the entire process and not just how to create a loop. But for these resources, they're all great resources. Some of them are USAID specific, some of them are not. Some of them, like Danella Meadows, she was one of the primary systems thinkers who started systems thinking way back in like the 70s, I believe. And so we just wanted to share a few resources that you all can look at before the next webinar or after it, and get familiar with some of the other ways that you can use system sensing to guide your work. Not all of these are specific to causal loop diagram. We wanted to give you a vast array of resources so that you can see sort of what all is out there and what all exists. So yeah, that's what I'll say on the resources. So I think with that, we'll just leave our contact info for Global Knowledge Initiative, and do one final reminder to read the case study before the next webinar if you plan on joining, and do the quiz that Hina mentioned. We'll send an email out with that information along with the slides and the recording. And thank you all for joining. We had a great time and we hope that you all did as well.
Yep, and if you have any more questions about the next sessions, feel free to email us at this email and we'll be sure to get back to you. And thank you.
Yes, thank you all.